Hello everybody and welcome back to our next installment of How Things Work. And on this week's episode we're going to be talking about the mystery of petrol, and in particular we're going to look at the difference between 95 and 93 octane and what influence those two octanes have on the performance of your engine, the fuel consumption, and perhaps some reliability issues that may come about if you're using the wrong octane in the wrong engine. So first of all, let's have a look at how fuel is made. And ironically, this is not too dissimilar to how we distill alcohol. So for those of you that make your own alcohol at home, you'll be comfortable with this process. But amazingly enough, we take a barrel of oil that we get from the ground, and that barrel of oil is filled with hundreds and hundreds of different types of hydrocarbons. We then take the oil, we put it through a furnace, and we heat it up. And as we heat it up, we break the bonds of those hydrocarbons, and we get a varying amount of different product out of it. Anything from gas through to our petrol or gasoline, kerosene, diesel, lubricating oil, right down to waxes. So the basic principle is that with our hydrocarbon chains that we have, the more carbon we have in these chains, the more energy it takes for us to break these chains and for the hydrocarbons to actually boil out. So we can see here the first one is methane, which only has one carbon atom in the chain. The second one is butane, which has two. The third one is propane, which has three. Now propane is the gas that you use on your braais. So you can see it takes more and more energy for us to boil these up in that reactor that we showed you in the first slide. Now we work through all the different chains of hydrocarbons until we get to one that is called heptane. Now heptane stands for 7, and as you'll see here, there are 7 carbon atoms in this chain that we've got to break before it boils out. The third one is one that is called octane, and it's octane because octane means 8, and we will then have 8 carbon atoms in the chain. So going back to our first slide that we showed you in terms of how we distill the crude oil, and with our new understanding of how the carbon atoms actually work in terms of the chains, we can see that the ones that have the least amount of carbon atoms in the chain are the ones that evaporate first, and those are our gases. And we work our way down until we get to things like our petrol or gasoline, kerosene, diesel, our lubricating oils, waxes, and the like. So what is the actual difference between 93 and 95 octane, and how do they produce it? Well, once we've boiled out the heptane and the octane, all we do is we blend the two together. So 93 octane is in fact 93% octane and 7% heptane blended together, and 95 octane is logically 95% octane plus a 5% blend of heptane. So what is the implication of 93 and 95 in our engines? Well, I want to give you a little bit of a lesson in science from Pascal, who you all recognize his name. And one of his laws tells us that for a closed container, the higher the temperature, the higher the pressure in the container. And the inverse is true. The higher the pressure in the container, the higher the temperature. So how does that relate now to our engines? So in the main, we have two types of engines. We have a high pressure engine and a low pressure engine. You might have read about a compression ratio when you've looked at the specs on an engine. And what the compression ratio tells us is the difference in volume that the piston scribes through versus the volume that's left over between the top of the piston and the start of the head. That's our compression ratio. So a little rule of thumb that I've got is that if your compression ratio on your engine is less than 10:1, chances are you've got a low pressure engine. And an example of that would be typically found in our old 8-valve motors. If it's larger than 10:1, we're going to have a high pressure engine, and examples of those are our 16-valve motors. And in fact, these days with direct injection engines, we're sitting at compression ratios of about 12:1. So we've learnt already that it takes more energy to create octane than it does to create heptane. So the logic is that it takes more energy and more temperature to burn octane versus heptane. And herein lies the challenge. If you've got a low pressure engine and you put 95 fuel into your low pressure engine, it's not going to get to enough of a temperature or pressure scenario to burn all your 95 fuel. So you're wasting good money after bad. You're absolutely not going to get any more performance out of it. In fact, 93 and 95 octane have the same calorific value. In other words, the same amount of energy per kilogram. So it's not like you get this additional burst of power out of the fuel. It's all about at what temperature the fuel combusts at. And the same is true, and this is very, very important for us as consumers. One thing you'll notice is that 93 fuel is cheaper than 95. So obviously it's very tempting for us in these economic times, and we've just now had an announcement of a massive fuel price increase. It's very tempting for us to go, well, hang on a second, I think I'm going to rather fill up my vehicle with 93 octane because it's cheaper. But the problem with that is that we now have a high pressure engine, which means we're creating higher temperatures and pressures. And that means that the 93 octane fuel is literally going to combust before the piston reaches its top dead center position. And what that causes is pre-detonation. And pre-detonation is devastating for an engine. That's the first point. So we're going to introduce reliability issues. But the second most important point is that pre-detonation simply causes our engine management system to start retarding the timing to cope with all this pre-detonation. So now we're going to get even worse fuel consumption, worse efficiency out of our engine, and ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not going to see any economic advantage by putting 93 fuel into a high pressure engine. In fact, the reverse is true. It's probably going to cost us more in maintenance. So that's it. That's the difference between 93 and 95 octane, and we've seen a little bit on how we produce fuel in the first place. And I think the key message here is that don't be tempted to put the wrong fuels into your engine. Make sure that the fuel matches what the manufacturer has specified. They've specified that for a reason, and it's only going to end in tears with further damage or worse fuel consumption. But thanks for watching this episode, and make sure to look out for future episodes on how things work.